Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down one economist's take on the major pressures facing Australia, from its place on the world stage right down to the fault lines in its domestic politics.
We're kicking things off with a pretty stark warning from economist Adam Creighton. He's basically saying that Australia is heading for a massive political shakeup, a lot like what's happened in British politics recently. So let's dig into why he thinks the country's at such a critical point.
To really get our heads around his perspective, we're going to follow this sort of funnel structure, starting broad and then getting narrower. We'll look at an international opportunity, a really persistent economic problem, the huge pressure on housing, a potential political earthquake, and finally, a critical debate over free speech.
All right, first up, let's take a look at Australia's role on the global stage. So, according to Creighton, an invitation from the U.S. president to join a board of peace isn't just some minor diplomatic handshake. No, he sees it as a huge opportunity, a real chance for Australia to get back some of the influence he believes it's been losing.
He calls this offer a fig leaf. A simple but really effective way to cover up what he views as a decline in Australia's international standing. And with only a handful of spots up for grabs, he argues that saying yes is a no-brainer.
Okay, now let's bring it back home and talk about the pressures building up here, starting with the economy. This is where that funnel we talked about really starts to narrow. Because while opportunity might be knocking on the world stage, Creighton paints a very, very different picture of the situation at home.
And you can see the contrast right here. It's pretty stark, isn't it? Creighton calls Australia's inflation rate, which is hanging around 4%, both stubborn and, frankly, embarrassing when you put it next to key allies like the US and the UK. They've managed to wrestle theirs down to about 2%.
So, what's driving this? Well, he points the finger directly at the rate of money creation. The M3 money supply, that's basically a wide measure of all the cash and deposits sloshing around in the economy, is growing at 7% a year. He argues that this sheer volume of new dollars is just watering down the value of the currency. And all that extra money has to find a home, which helps push up the price of everything, especially houses.
And that brings us to his crucial point. He believes the Reserve Bank just hasn't done enough. In his view, interest rates simply have to go up to cool things down and get what he calls an out-of-control housing market back in check.
Of course, all this economic pressure feeds directly into one of the most talked about, most stressful issues in the country, the housing crisis. And according to this analysis, it's a classic story of overwhelming demand crashing into not nearly enough supply.
Let's start with the demand side. Creighton points to the sheer scale of recent immigration. Citing figures around 500,000 permanent and long-term arrivals in a single year, well, he sees that as a primary engine driving up demand for housing.
Then you flip over to the supply side, and you can see the problem clear as day. The government has a target for building new homes, but the actual number of new builds is falling way short, by about 60,000 homes. That's a huge gap.
So what happens next? Well, he says it's inevitable. Rents and house prices are just going through the roof. His conclusion is pretty blunt. Unless there is a massive pause on immigration to let supply even begin to catch up, the affordability crisis is just going to keep getting worse.
Now, these intense pressures in the economy and the housing market, they don't just stay in their own lanes. According to Creighton, all this frustration is causing some major cracks in the political foundation of the country.
And he points to recent polling as Exhibit A. Check this out. Support for the One Nation Party, which historically has been down around 10%, has suddenly surged to 23% in a couple of different polls. That's a huge jump.
He doesn't pull any punches with his language. He calls this potential shift a political earthquake. I mean, that's a level of support for a third party that could seriously disrupt the traditional two-party system we're all used to.
So the key takeaway here isn't just about one party's rise. He sees it as a symptom of a much wider frustration. People fed up with how the establishment is handling these core issues, immigration and the cost of living. And that's pulling support away from both of the major parties.
And that brings us to the very tip of our funnel, a really fundamental debate over a basic right, sparked by new legislation that's currently making its way through Parliament.
So the debate is all about these proposed hate speech laws, which have already passed the lower house. Creighton is firmly against them, calling the whole thing a huge mistake.
And to make his point, he makes a really provocative comparison. He argues that, in his view, these new laws are even more tough than China's laws. Why? Because he says the standard for what counts as an offense is so low that it can be based on hypothetical harm, not something that actually happened.
So for him, it all boils down to this. The laws we already have are sufficient. He believes these new kind of vague laws are a major overreaction that could pose a real threat to free speech in Australia.
And that brings us to the end of this diagnosis. From a shaky position on the world stage to these deep-seated crises at home, in the economy, in housing, in politics, this expert's view paints a picture of a nation under some incredible pressure. And it leaves us all with a pretty tough question, doesn't it? When everything feels like an emergency, where do you even start?